Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with the skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, here in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Tomorrow, Thursday, April 22nd at 5 p.m., the Eudora Welty House and Garden, in partnership with the Visiting Writer Series at Millsaps College, will host an outdoor poetry reading and book signing with Mississippi Poet Laureate Beth Ann Fennelly. You can find more details on the department's website, the Welty House website, or the Welty House Facebook page. But please join us for that. And I hope that you'll join us next week for History is Lunch when Claire Whitlinger will discuss her book, Between Remembrance and Repair, commemorating racial violence in Philadelphia, Mississippi. That will be our final History is Lunch in this streaming-only format, as we will be able to welcome you all back here into the Nielsen Auditorium on the following week, May 5th, for our first in-person History is Lunch since March of last year. We'll be masked and socially distanced, but we'll be glad to see you all here once again as Jennifer Bond will talk to us about her new book, Buildings of Mississippi. We will, of course, continue to live stream these programs, so those of you who've become accustomed to participating in that way will be able to keep doing so. Again, that's 2 weeks from now on May 5th. Today, we are delighted to have Crystal Sanders, who will present After Freedom Summer, the Child Development Group of Mississippi, and the Ongoing Fight for Black Freedom. Crystal R. Sanders is an associate professor of history and the former director of the Africana Research Center at Pennsylvania State University. During the 2020-21 academic year, she is a fellow at the National Humanities Center. Sanders graduated with her BA cum laude in history and public policy from Duke University and earned a PhD in history from Northwestern University. Sanders' University of North Carolina Press book, A Chance for Change, Head Start, and Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle, won the 2017 Critics' Choice Award from the American Educational Research Association and the 2017 New Scholars Book Award from Division F of the American Educational Research Association. Crystal will join us via Zoom from her office in Pennsylvania. You can ask questions of her in the comments section of this live stream, and I'll pass those along at the appropriate time. For now, welcome Crystal Sanders.
Hello, and thank you so much, Chris, for that warm introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I'm honored to have the opportunity to participate in the NDAH's History is Lunch series. I know that several of my colleagues and several of my favorite authors on Mississippi history have participated in this series. It's a great honor for me to be among them. Today, my talk is titled After Freedom Summer, the Child Development Group of Mississippi and the Ongoing Fight for Black Freedom. Most studies of civil rights in Mississippi or studies on the Black freedom struggle in Mississippi focus on the 1964 Freedom Summer. Many of you probably remember that summer campaign culminated in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the interracial Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenged the legitimacy and the morality of Mississippi's all-white Democratic Party delegation at the National Convention, and the MFDP came up short because of backroom political wheeling and dealing. I wanted to know what happened in Mississippi after 1964. After many student workers left the state and media attention turned elsewhere, I wondered what working class Black Mississippians did to continue their earlier civil rights work. I was struck by a quote from Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was interviewed by numerous journalists in the aftermath of Atlantic City. And one of the things Mrs. Hamer said, and I quote, is, "We have to build our own power. The question for Black people is not, when is the white man going to give us our rights, or when is he going to give us good education for our children? We have to take rights for ourselves," end quote. Mrs. Hamer's marching orders demonstrated that African Americans in Mississippi understood that they had to secure their own political, economic, and social freedom. President Lyndon Johnson had signed into law the 1964 Civil Rights Act weeks before the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, but enforcement of that act was a different matter. Segregationists in Mississippi, for example, closed facilities rather than comply with the ban on racial discrimination in public accommodations. What you see on the screen is a newspaper article from July 7th, 1964. The Civil Rights Act went into effect on July 2nd, 1964, 5 days earlier. After the Civil Rights Act went into effect, many business owners, white business owners in the state of Mississippi, closed their businesses rather than comply with desegregation. The article that I'm pointing to illuminates that fact. Now, in 1965, after President Lyndon Johnson signs into law the Voting Rights Act, it would be over a year before federal registrars arrived in Mississippi counties with the worst records of Black disfranchisement. For those of you who are lovers of Mississippi history, you know that Vernon Damer, a Black man from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, is killed in January of 1966 after encouraging African Americans to register to vote. Notice I said January 1966. This was after enactment of the Voting Rights Act. So we see that businesses in Mississippi are closing after the Civil Rights Act. We see that African Americans are still losing their lives after the Voting Rights Act. Now, in the book, I suggest, or I argue, that working class Black Mississippians understood that civil rights legislation alone could not improve their plight. They understood that white segregationists would continue to flaunt their white supremacist policies in the face of federal law. Therefore, local Black Mississippians cast their lot with a federal preschool program to take rights for themselves, as Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer suggested, and they created something that I call the Child Development Group of Mississippi, which was one of the largest inaugural Head Start programs in the country. And the Child Development Group of Mississippi, or CDGM for short, allowed ordinary Black citizens to control something other than their churches. They got the opportunity to administer a multi-million-dollar early childhood education program. They freed themselves from the economic control of local white employers, and they seized an opportunity to give Black preschoolers an early childhood education that negated notions of Black inferiority. As many of you know, Head Start was a component of President Johnson's War on Poverty that was authorized by the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 and administered by the Office of Economic Opportunity, known as OEO. OEO aimed to provide low-income Americans with the skills, training, and political power to ameliorate their plight. And the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 contained 7 titles that expanded opportunity for the nation's poorest citizens. Funded programs included Job Corps, Work Study, and Volunteers in Service to America, commonly known as VISTA. Title II of the Economic Opportunity Act created the Community Action Program to be operated with the maximum feasible participation of the poor. The Community Action Program proved to be the most controversial title of the Economic Opportunity Act because it allowed the Office of Economic Opportunity to bypass local governments and fund nonprofit agencies. This meant that in some parts of the South, including in Mississippi, the federal government worked directly with African Americans without local white oversight. Now, when the Economic Opportunity Act is created in 1964, Head Start is not a program that was included in any of those titles. But OEO officials created the Head Start program after learning that 50% of low-income individuals in the United States were under the age of 5. So Sergeant Shriver, who directed the Office of Economic Opportunity, realized that all of these programs that had been created under the original 7 titles of the Economic Opportunity Act, none of those programs would change the lives of the youngest citizens in our country. And over half of those living in poverty were under the age of 5. So in early 1965, OEO's architects and OEO's planners created a program that would offer young children from low-income families educational and developmental services to prepare them for school. So the idea was that children who complete high school have a greater chance of not one day living in poverty. And research showed that children who got a head start, who got a strong educational foundation, were less likely to drop out of school. So it's these OEO planners and strategists working with educators and psychologists and social workers from across the country come up with this Head Start program as a way to influence, right, or to change or improve the lives of the youngest citizens living in poverty in the country. And when Head Start is created in early 1965, it's conceived as an 8-week summer program, something that would just happen every summer. But in that inaugural summer of 1965, Head Start was so successful that its architects moved quickly to make it a year-round program that children from low-income families would be able to access year-round. Now, what's interesting is that Head Start was funded under the Community Action Program. And as a community action program, rather than merely an early childhood education intervention, Head Start provided employment and leadership opportunities for parents and other community members to create institutional change at the local level through these people's maximum feasible participation in Head Start employment and decision making. So saying that a different way, the idea is it doesn't help a child to get out of poverty if you give that child early childhood education without ensuring that that child's parents have access to well-paying jobs, have access to decent housing, have access to nutritious foods to feed that child, right? So the idea is you help children who are living in poverty by helping their families to get out of poverty. And to make clear of Head Start's twofold mission of being both a community action program and an early childhood education program, OEO's official publication stated that Head Start was not a kindergarten, but rather a communigarden, right? A communigarden being a program that's going to benefit the entire community. One thing that I found interesting as I was writing the book was that in its initial years, Head Start did not require teachers to have college degrees or formal credentials. Anyone who read on an 8th grade level and had a love for children were qualified to teach. And there were many reasons why Head Start's architects did not place a premium on credentialed educators. But the most important reason was that in 1965, there were very few early childhood education teachers nationwide. At that time, only 16 states had statewide public kindergartens, right? Mississippi doesn't have public kindergarten in 1965. So there was this fear that if you used elementary and secondary education teachers for the Head Start program, they would not easily adapt to Head Start's comprehensive program. They were not going to be easily able to switch from the models they used in traditional public school classrooms to these early childhood education classrooms that were going to be community focused and community centered, right? So because of that, Head Start creates an untraditional core of educators, right? So essentially, and another reason that I should mention here is that Head Start was supposed to be a community action program. It was supposed to create jobs for people in the community as a way of helping children and their families to get out of poverty. So by employing local people as Head Start teachers, as Head Start administrators, the Head Start program is creating the very types of jobs that they believed would help young people and their families. Now, when news of Head Start reached rural Black communities throughout Mississippi, the voting rights legislation that would become the 1965 Voting Rights Act had only been before Congress for 25 days. Most of the student nonviolent coordinating members who had worked in the state from 1961 to 1964 had already left the state, right? And yet you have these Black Mississippians from rural hamlets and backwoods areas who are listening attentively to details about this national Head Start program that's going to begin in the upcoming summer, a program that was sponsored by a Democratic administration, however, it being the same Democratic administration that had refused to seat the MFDP in Atlantic City a year earlier. Despite this perhaps well well-earned suspicion of the Johnson administration, local people unanimously voted to work with white liberals and submit an application for a Head Start grant. They saw this, they being working class Black Mississippians, Black parents in particular, saw Head Start as an opportunity to offer their children the quality, early childhood education that they had never been able to receive before. We know that since slavery, African Americans had championed education as a path to advancement and considered it a central part of their freedom struggle. During Reconstruction, we know that Black Mississippians created one of the most radical public systems of education in the nation. While many states mandated segregated public schools, Mississippi's Black legislators refused to erect a color line in the 1870 state constitution that created statewide public schools, and they guaranteed every student an education with equal advantages without regard to race. We also know that despite this, the absence of mandatory segregation, equitable educational opportunities for Black students did not exist in Mississippi's public schools. These schools faced inadequate funding, shorter academic terms, no bus transportation, and white hostility. From the 1870s until well into the post-World War II period, spending disparities existed between Black and white education in the Magnolia State. Many areas did not even offer high school education for Black students. African Americans remained powerless to address this inequity since they lacked access to the ballot box. Head Start was the chance to provide Black children with educational opportunities void of inferior resources, because these were going to be resources coming directly from the federal government that were not going to be filtered by local white school boards. On the screen is an image of a Mississippi schoolhouse in 1921. While school consolidation resulted in modern, expansive brick schoolhouses for white students, many Black students continued to receive their education in one-room schoolhouses lacking heating and plumbing. Separate was not equal, but Head Start provided Black Mississippians with the opportunity to give their children a different educational experience. And I should have told you that the picture on the top left of the screen was one of the meetings as local people are learning about the possibility of applying for a Head Start grant. Now, another reason why Head Start was extremely appealing to Black Mississippians was because of the increased mechanization of agriculture in the state during the 1950s and 1960s. This mechanization made Black labor expendable. During this time, the percentage of the Delta's cotton picked by machine rose from 7 to 50%, while the number of sharecroppers fell by 70%. Head Start and the employment opportunities that it provided meant that some of the most impoverished citizens could feed their families. Additionally, in Mississippi, I've had a cold for a few days. Additionally, in Mississippi, many African Americans had lost their jobs because of their proximity to the civil rights movement. So they envisioned the Head Start program as their opportunity to once again earn a wage. And this time, their employer would be outside of the local white power structure. A little bit more water. Okay, so at an interest meeting in the spring of 1965, working class Black Mississippians voted to create a nonprofit organization called the Child Development Group of Mississippi. Lavery Jones, a Black woman from Hollandale, Mississippi, attended that first meeting. She recalled, organizers announced, "I have some good news for you. Money has been appropriated for Head Start. And this means that if you find a building and get some children to sign up, you can keep and teach your own children and get paid." Well, that was the answer to a prayer, end quote. That was Mrs. Jones's words about learning about the possibility of a Head Start grant being given to, to Black communities across the state. The availability of large sums of federal money for Black-run Head Start centers was not a done deal, however. CDGM supporters had to find a way to get around the governor's veto. Mississippi's governor in 1965 was Governor Paul Johnson, a man whose claim to fame was physically blocking federal marshals from helping James Meredith desegregate the University of Mississippi in 1962. And the way the Economic Opportunity Act was written in 1964, it gave governors the opportunity to veto community action programs that were not funded by institutions of higher education. So what this essentially meant was that governors that were upset with the sight of a Job Corps site, or that were upset with the funding that community action programs were receiving through private agencies, could veto those programs, could block those grants from going through. But there was that loophole that said governors could not veto grants that were run by or sponsored by institutions of higher education. So at that point, CDGM supporters knew they needed to secure the sponsorship of an institution of higher education in the state. For those of you who know about Mississippi's institutions of higher education, you know that there are 3 public institutions of higher education. And in 1965, these three Black public institutions of higher education. And in 1965, none of these Black colleges wanted to risk upsetting Mississippi's all-white legislature by sponsoring CDGM's Head Start program, because sponsoring that program would have definitely hurt their state appropriation, right? So the 3 public HBCUs were out of the question. Logically, it would seem Tougaloo College, that had been a bastion of civil rights activism, that had been the place that allowed people like Ann Moody and Joyce and Dory Ladner to really find their footing as activists and leaders, seemed to be the logical choice, right, to sponsor a program like this. But the Mississippi legislature had already been finding ways to crack down on Tougaloo, even though it was a private institution. And the legislature had been threatening to revoke Tougaloo's charter to be able to even exist in that state as an educational institution. So Tougaloo's leaders really didn't want to get involved, because they said, we're already in hot water. We are already really disliked by Mississippi's political officials, so we can't support you. We can't help you. We can't sponsor this grant. At that point, when Tougaloo said no, many CDGM supporters believed they weren't going to get the grant, that they weren't going to find an institution that would help them bypass Governor Johnson's veto. However, a couple of people said, wait, what about Mary Holmes Junior College, which was an unaccredited Black Presbyterian institution in the Northeast section of the state? And CDGM officials went to Mary Holmes as president and basically told them the situation. We need a college to sponsor our grant in order to avoid the veto. Mary Holmes' administrator essentially said, well, what is in it for us? You know, that's going to take a chance. We just don't go around trying to upset, Mississippi's white power structure. So what is in it for us? And CDGM officials told them that by sponsoring the CDGM grant, they would become available to receive funding for the administrative costs of essentially serving as the headquarters for CDGM's operation. So Mary Holmes Junior College agreed to serve as the sponsor for CDGM, insulating CDGM from the governor's reach. And in May of 1965, the Office of Economic Opportunity awarded CDGM a grant for $1.5 million to run an 8-week Head Start program during the 1965 summer. $1.5 million is a lot of money today, but in 1965, $1.5 million was essentially like $1 billion. And this is money that's being poured directly into Black communities to provide Head Start to Black children. In that 1965 summer, CDGM operated 84 centers and served 6,000 children in 24 counties. 50 of those centers were in the Black majority Delta region. And as I said earlier, Head Start was conceived as an 8-week summer program, but in the fall of 1965, Head Start became a year-round initiative. Between 1965 and 1968, CDGM received $15 million in grants from the Office of Economic Opportunity, $15 million. And the list of funded communities could have easily been mistaken for a SNCC or MFDP roster of sites. So when we think of places like Lynn Allen with Jake and Lily Ayers, when we think of places like Harmony, Mississippi with Winston Hudson, when we think of places like Myersville, Mississippi, when you need a black world, these are all sites or these are all communities that won CDGM grants. And the people I listed were really, authorizing or were allocating this money. So money has been put into the hands of Black activists living in communities that have been central to all of the community organizing that had been going on in Mississippi in earlier parts of the 1960s. In the book, I explain that as local people are controlling large sums of money, this meant that they had some power. Head Start centers required furniture. They required school supplies. They required food items such as milk. When a vendor made Black customers enter through a Black door or refused to address them with courtesy titles such as Mr. or Mrs., CDGM employees could then take their money, this federal money, elsewhere, right? They could demand to be treated respectfully. They could demand to be treated with courtesy. And if those vendors refused to comply, they would take those federal dollars elsewhere. So essentially now, this Head Start program has given movement workers monetary resources, right? Monetary resources that mean that white businesses either have to shape up or they're going to lose out on these opportunities. These monetary resources could also be used to encourage African Americans to register to vote. Many people have been afraid to register because they knew they could lose their jobs. They knew they could be that they could be kicked off plantations, as was the case with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. But if they are working for CDGM, where their paycheck is coming from the federal government, the fear of losing one's job was not nearly as great, right? So Head Start and the money that it's pouring into Mississippi is very important in ways that we don't think about. When we think of Head Start, we're not thinking about civil rights. We're not thinking about how Head Start can foster voter registration. We're not thinking about how Head Start can make a white business owner allow Black patrons to enter through the front door. But these were the ways in which CDGM's grant changed the racial status quo. Now, CDGM's program stood out because of its untraditional teaching staff and because of its radical curriculum. Working class Black women were at the helm of CDGM classrooms. And while few of these women had any knowledge of the most popular pedagogical methods of the day, what they did know was that their children's unquestioned acceptance of and acquiesce to the racial status quo could produce an even more dismal future. As these women designed lesson plans and debated classroom management techniques before CDGM centers opened in July of 1965, these women discussed how they wanted to change the lives of their students. During a discussion on student discipline, one woman asserted, and I quote, "If we don't teach the children anything else, let's teach them to speak their mind. Never mind obedience. They will fit in as they grow. I don't want anyone shaming my grandchild in no chair." End quote. Commanding obedience from Black children had been a form of survival since slavery. In many instances, Black parents had demanded complete obedience to ensure their children's acquiesced to the unspoken rules of a segregated society. Whether it was stepping off the sidewalk when a white person passed or not making eye contact with a white woman, Black parents had laid out the rules and meticulously enforced them. These untraditional teachers and Head Start centers prepared their pupils to live in what they hoped would be a post-civil rights world that required a new mentality and a new behavior. The goals of CDGM's program were similar to those of the earlier freedom movement, and that both tried to change the way people thought about themselves and their potential. CDGM staff saw developing Black children's capabilities as a way to change society. They taught their students not just letters and numbers, but how to ask questions and think for themselves. Skills that also prepared these youngsters to question the status quo. One science lesson plan distributed to all CDGM centers stated that if students were encouraged to be curious, they would not, and I quote, simply accept every word a white man says later in life, end quote. Preschoolers who had no concept of asserting themselves were suddenly voting on what color crayon they should use, red or blue. To celebrate Blackness, CDGM staff went so far to suggest substituting the anniversary of Nat Turner's rebellion or the anniversary of the assassination of Medgar Evers in place of traditionally recognized holidays such as George Washington's birthday, Labor Day, or Veterans Day. The proposed substitutions spoke to the sense of Black pride that ruminated throughout CDGM centers. Since the creation of Black public schools in Mississippi during Reconstruction, Black parents had not had control over what their children learned. White superintendents and school boards controlled the curriculum, or they controlled the overt curriculum, because we know that Black teachers did things undercover. I can't emphasize enough how important it was that in Mississippi, for Black children to receive CDGM's brand of education. This was the state that almost passed a textbook ordinance in 1940 that would have banned the use of textbooks that mentioned voting and democracy in Black public schools. CDGM provided Black children with the knowledge of self necessary to later critique, challenge, and improve their communities. Now, CDGM not only tapped into Black children's intellectual potential, but they also addressed their physical needs. Like all children nationwide, CDGM students received breakfast and lunch daily. And these meals included diverse food items such as fried steak, creamed potatoes, lima beans, carrot sticks, rolls, and milk. Without CDGM, most students' diets would have lacked protein and consisted only of starches available from the Federal Food Commodities Program. In many cases, Head Start's food program was often the difference between survival and starvation. Malnourishment and hunger prevented children from learning, so both organizations, meaning Head Start at the national level and Head Start at the local level, made creating optimal learning environments a priority. Following national Head Start directives, CDGM students also had dental, vision, hearing, speech, tuberculosis, and psychological screenings. These children also received immunizations and had urine tests. And for many of the CDGM students, this was the very first time that they were being treated by medical professionals. A significant number of Black Mississippians had never seen a doctor, right? And I should add that in many of these rural communities where white health department officials refused to partner with CDGM centers, it took Black doctors from other parts of the state, like Dr. Robert Smith in Jackson, to come into these rural areas and conduct these health screenings because local medical officials refused. And CDGM doctors treated a host of ailments and diseases prevalent in impoverished communities, including high rates of anemia and intestinal parasites. Sometimes, even the materials that had been purchased for playtime were co-opted for medicinal purposes. So in one community, CDGM had purchased wading pools for the children to play in the water. However, those pools had to be repurposed and turned into bathtubs, since many of the children had skin conditions and lived in homes without tubs or running water. We know that healthcare had long been an issue in the Mississippi Black freedom struggle, and CDGM attempted to alleviate some of those health concerns that Black children were faced with. You know, many of you may be wondering if CDGM served white children, since I continuously mentioned Black children. And let me just say here that very few white children benefited from CDGM's program. In most cases, white parents refused to allow their kids to sit in classrooms with Black children. And in other cases, white parents feared reprisal or ostracism if they crossed the color line. In a very few places did white students attend CDGM centers. And typically those were centers in the Gulf region. So in places like Gulfport, there would be a handful of white children that participated in CDGM's program. Now, to ensure that Black students, Black youngsters had the opportunity to interact with white people and not do so on a superiority, inferiority basis, CDGM recruited white college students to work in CDGM centers. But these white college students were told in no uncertain terms that they were not to be the teachers, they were not to be the leaders of these centers, but instead they were to be assistants and aides that would help Black women in particular run and manage their classrooms. Now, while the Head Start program certainly went a long way in improving the lives, meaning the physical health and the educational preparation of Black children, it also created many new opportunities for their parents. Black women outnumbered Black men among CDGM staff, and these women often credited CDGM with giving them a head start. Hattie Saffold is one of the women I'm going to be talking about a little later, but one of the quotes that she mentioned that I'll never forget was a quote where she says, when she's asked about her CDGM employment, she says, "I've experienced too much now. I'd rather pack up my little bag and leave the state than go back to what I used to do." Saffold had previously worked as a cotton chopper on land she did not own before she secured CDGM employment. And there are literally hundreds of stories like this of Black women who had worked as domestics in white homes or had worked as agricultural workers on white land, leaving those jobs and securing Head Start jobs where they had the opportunity to work with their children or children from their communities, and they were able to assume the title of educator, which is a revered position or title in Black communities. Many of these women through Head Start get the opportunity to go back to school. They earn their GEDs. Many of them earn bachelor's degrees. As these women are receiving Head Start training, many of them are leaving their counties and the state of Mississippi for the first time in their lives. Head Start is putting them on planes and flying them to New York, to Alabama, to Washington, D.C., to Wisconsin, to receive various trainings that were, essential to the Head Start operation. So CDGM is really creating a new world for these women who have often been cast aside and not given the opportunity to really explore their leadership skills before now. Now, I mentioned Hattie Saffold, and I want to talk about her more just briefly because her story really illuminates the ways in which CDGM created financial freedom for Black Mississippians. And as I told you, Hattie Saffold, who was a native of Holmes County, had worked as a cotton chopper before she secured employment as a Head Start teacher in a Holmes County CDGM center. And in the fall of 1965, Hattie Saffold and a group of other Black parents decided that they were going to enroll their kids in the previously all-white Durant Elementary School. As you all know, as was often the case, segregationists would attempt to prevent school desegregation by intimidating Black parents. One of the most common forms of intimidation was to put up flyers around town listing the names of parents who had put in applications to have their children attend an all-white school, previously all-white school, and then bankers and landlords, white bankers and landlords would see these names. They would then begin to call in loans or threaten eviction or threaten job termination. And these parents would then remove their application for their child to enter an all-white school. And that was a way to preserve segregation, right? These economic reprisals, these forms of intimidation. So in 1965, that's exactly what happens. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen is a flyer that went up around town listing the names of Black parents who planned to enroll their kids in Durant Elementary School that had been an all-white elementary school in the fall of 1965. After these flyers go up around town, every single parent on this list removes their application or withdraws their application except for Hattie B. Saffold. Hattie Bell Saffold, who you see her name is listed on the right column about midway. Hattie Saffold essentially said, what are they going to do to me? I work for the federal government. I'm a Head Start teacher. And in fact, in the fall of 1965, her daughter Catherine would be the only Black child to enter Durant Elementary School. There are countless stories like Hattie Bell Saffold's story, countless stories of Head Start employment, giving African Americans the financial freedom to demand, to demand better educational opportunities for their children, to demand better living conditions, to demand the opportunity to be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote. Well, I could list several other examples. I'm only going to list one more for the sake of time, and that is the example of Roxy Meredith. Roxy Meredith was a public school cafeteria worker, but she lost that job after her son, James Meredith, desegregates the University of Mississippi in 1962. Now, for those of you who are familiar with James Meredith's story, you know that he was a grown man when he desegregated Ole Miss. He had not lived at home in nearly a decade. He had his own family. He really had nothing to do with his parents in the sense that he was on his own. He was independent by this time. So what we know about civil rights history is that anyone that has proximity to someone challenging the racial status order is in jeopardy of being targeted. And in this case, public school officials fired Roxy Meredith for her proximity, being the mother of James Meredith, who's desegregated the white flagship. She does not find steady employment again until she is hired as a cook in a CDGM center. Again, like Hattie Saffold, we see that CDGM becomes a lifeline. CDGM becomes a way to maintain economic security in the face of white reprisals. Another person I can mention would be Pap Hamer, the husband of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was fired and evicted from their plantation, the Marlowe plantation, after Mrs. Hamer attempted to register to vote years earlier. He does not have steady work until he's able to get work in 1965 as a CDGM bus driver. So what we know is that there are hundreds of people like Hattie Saffold, Roxy Meredith, and Pap Hamer who would have remained unemployed as a result of their relationship to the movement, if not for CDGM. The Head Start program freed these individuals from the economic reprisals of local white employers. Now, by now, you should be saying, CDGM's program is doing so much that it has to be fostering white resistance. And indeed, CDGM's program precipitated large-scale white resistance. For example, 5 whites in Boulevard County entered a CDGM center and beat 2 teachers in late July. Klansmen in Washington County burned down a wooden church that served as a CDGM site. Segregationists opposed CDGM because the Head Start program gave decision-making power to African Americans. The Head Start program provided Black children with an educational program that was not monitored or filtered by white officials. These people who opposed CDGM understood that if the poorest of the poor could run Head Start centers, they could also run towns and make decisions for themselves. Despite all of the arson and the vandalism that occurred to CDGM centers across the state, in the book, I argue that the greatest resistance or the biggest threat to CDGM's continuation was John Stennis, the junior senator from the state of Mississippi. And in 1965, Stennis sat on both the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee, assignments that gave him control over funding for both the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty. And Stennis used his political clout to discredit CDGM's program because he disliked the fact that CDGM placed federal dollars and control of an educational enterprise directly into the hands of Black activists, upending the tradition of federal largesse, propping up white supremacy in Mississippi. Now, Stennis received a lot of help in his effort to discredit CDGM, and he received much assistance from the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, a state agency created in 1956 to resist civil rights and preserve segregation. And the Sovereignty Commission used its extensive espionage powers to undermine CDGM. The Sovereignty Commission infiltrated CDGM's central office with a paid informant who posed as a secretary and furnished copies of all correspondence and memoranda to commission officials. The preschool spy also reported civil rights activity conducted during business hours and recounted alleged employee acts of drunkenness. Commission officials then airmailed copies of these reports to Senator Stennis. By questioning the leadership qualifications and bookkeeping of CDGM teachers and administrators, Stennis, who had never before expressed interest in Black education, raised what appeared to be valid criticisms. This method, while less dramatic than a filibuster on the Senate floor, was a means to the same end: the preservation of white supremacy. OEO responds to the political pressure by moving to replace CDGM with a Head Start program called Mississippi Action for Progress, or MAP. MAP was more acceptable to Mississippi's white power structure. And MAP was a new program that was interracial, that used credentialed educators in the classroom, and that introduced a curriculum that was void of Black history. OEO officials believed that they had created the perfect solution by bringing together middle-class African-Americans like Aaron Henry with white liberals like Harding Carter in the creation of MAP. They had, however, underestimated working-class Black Mississippians' ability to say no. CDGM employees and parents had cut their political teeth while administering earlier Head Start grants, and they quickly mobilized to contest this new organization. They operated CDGM centers on a voluntary basis. They refused to cooperate with MAP, and they called on the National NAACP office to request that all local NAACP chapters in Mississippi withdraw their support of the new Head Start program, MAP. They also drew on national contacts for support. One of the things I haven't told you are about many of the people who trained CDGM teachers. Polly Greenberg was a white staff member for CDGM who was in charge of teacher training and development. Polly Greenberg was also the sister-in-law of Jack Greenberg, who was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I could also have told you that Marion Wright, that we now know as Marion Wright Elderman, was CDGM's lawyer. Marion Wright had the ear of Robert Kennedy, right? They also were able to connect with prominent individuals like Martin Luther King and Walter Reuther. In 1966, drawing on this national support, CDGM is able to get an ad that you see on the screen, a full-page ad in the New York Times, where they're essentially saying that Sergeant Shriver has given them a raw deal, that he hasn't upheld his end of the bargain when it comes to community action. The pressure that Sergeant Shriver finds himself under when he learns that there's this full-page ad in the New York Times that's signed by some of the most prominent people in the country leads him to backtrack. When I say backtrack, Sergeant Shriver decides that OEO is going to fund both MAP centers and Head Start centers. So for 2 years, from 66 to 68, both MAP and CDGM are operating in the state of Mississippi. In 1968, CDGM's last grant expires and the Black-run preschool program ends. In the book, however, I argue that we shouldn't see this as a declension narrative. We shouldn't see this as a sad story, because CDGM provided Black women in particular with a chance for change, right? It gave them the opportunity to develop their leadership skills. They were able to cultivate confidence. And this struck a mighty blow, right, to the Mississippi supposition that Black men belonged in white men's fields and that Black women belonged in white women's kitchens. Ordinary Black women with little formal education transformed a federally funded preschool program into an opportunity to resist notions of Black inferiority. This is a story that I say matters because when we think about the war on poverty, there's often this narrative of failure that surrounds it. But when we look at a program like CDGM, we see that it was so successful that the powers that be worked to kill it. It was so successful at creating opportunities for Black women to administer multi-million-dollar grants, to participate in decision-making, to be able to sit on community governance boards, that people like Stennis and local mayors and commissioners throughout the state were alarmed and threatened by this new form of power and authority that Black women now had at the hands of the federal government. So I will stop there and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. That was great. there are both questions and comments, and I think what I'll do is go through some of the comments first and then let you respond to any of those you may want to, and then move on to the questions. Let's see. So Sarah Campbell says that Roderick Redd's grandmother, Mrs. Williametta Hall, worked for Head Start in Claiborne County. Angela Stewart writes that her father worked for years with MAP, providing opportunities to Head Start students and parents. Angela works at the Margaret Walker Center and further says that the Margaret Walker Center has an extensive Head Start oral history collection developed by Mrs. Lavery Jones. Anna Mae Mays says, 2 of my cousins, after getting teaching degrees from Jackson State, found jobs teaching in Durant. And then our friend, Mississippi hero and Black freedom struggle fearless warrior Joyce Ladner writes, I didn't know this about James Meredith's mother. I attended Jackson State with him. And then we have a question. One more comment. High school rising senior Martha Burgmark served as a teacher's aide during the first summer of Head Start in Jackson. She wanted to become a civil rights and legal services lawyer. And then we have a question from Sarah Campbell who asks, how many students were served in that first summer, and what percentage of the eligible population was that?
So first, let me say thank you to everyone for attending. I remember meeting Ms. Stewart, I believe, at a Mississippi Civil Rights Veterans Conference, and Dr. Ladner is one of my heroes. So I'm thankful for the 2 of them in attendance, and also everyone else. To some of those comments, I'll say that Claiborne County ran their own Head Start program, so they weren't a part of the CDGM program. And in Jackson, Jackson had their own Head Start centers as well that were not a part of CDGM's program. To the questions about the comments about MAP, I'll say that over time, tensions between CDGM supporters and MAP supporters dissolved or dissipated or subsided, and many CDGM women eventually did secure employment in MAP as Head Start teachers. MAP is still with us today. You know, MAP is still the largest Head Start provider in the state of Mississippi. And one of the things that gives me great joy is that many of MAP's Head Start centers are now named for Black women who worked in CDGM. And then to the comment, during that first summer, or to the question, during that first summer, CDGM's program served 6,000 children. I don't have a number for how many children might have been eligible, but what I will say is that there were many kids who wanted to attend who were turned away because there was not enough room. I'll also say that, again, CDGM served 6,000, but there were about 13 other Head Start programs operating in the state of Mississippi during that 1965 summer. Claiborne County had their own Head Start program. Jackson had its own Head Start program. So there were many more than 6,000 kids served during that first summer, but CDGM served 6,000 of them.
Have a comment and a compliment for you from Deirdre Payne. Head Start threatened John Stennis's Mississippi, so he torpedoed it at the federal appropriations level. Stennis did not want blacks to come out of poverty, be better educated, and leave sharecropping. She then says, thank you, Dr. Sanders. I enjoyed your presentation at the Mississippi Book Festival a few years ago, and even with a bad cold, your delivery of these facts is outstanding. Ann Barbara asks, how did you choose Mississippi to investigate instead of, say, a state like North Carolina or Alabama?
Well, first I'll say North Carolina is my home, and so I would have loved to have researched North Carolina. But my main research interest is Black educational history. And I was actually using some congressional record material looking for information about a protest that Howard University students did in 1934 at the House of Representatives dining hall. In that year, a group of Howard students led by Kenneth Clark, who we would know later of the doll study fame, decided that they were going to protest on Capitol Hill because the one black member of Congress and his staff were not allowed to eat in the House of Representatives dining hall for Congress people and their aides. And so I was researching this because the president of Howard, of course, is furious by the actions of the students, given Howard's need for that annual federal appropriation. And so Dr. Mordecai Johnson, the president, saw this as biting the hand that was feeding them. And so I was going into the congressional record to see if congressmen had spoken up about this protest that took place at the House of Representatives dining hall. And unfortunately, even though I had requested material from the 1930s, they brought me material from the 1960s. And as I was going through reading the material, I found a speech from Stennis on the Senate floor where he said that this Head Start program is a front for communists and beatniks. Education is the furthest thing from their mind. And I was struck because I saw Head Start, communist, beatniks. And I thought, what could be so bad about Head Start? How is Head Start political? Who would rail against Head Start? And so I was curious, and I did some more digging, and then I learned about this program and decided I wanted to write about it.
Joyce Ladner asks a personal question. Crystal, how is Victoria today?
Victoria is my 17, well, she'll be 17 months on the 22nd tomorrow. And she's my daughter. She's doing quite well.
Another question. What lessons should community organizers take from the Child Development Group of Mississippi story?
One of the things I think is striking is that CDGM really followed the SNCC model of not trying to go into a community and just tell local people what they need and what they should do. But, there was an effort to go into these communities, to listen to local people, to see who were the leaders of these communities, and to ask them, is this something that you think would be beneficial to your community? Is this something that you need? Is this a priority for your community? So number one, I think it teaches the CDGM model, replicating the SNCC model of not being top down with their administration and organization, really trying to understand a community, understand that community's needs, and provide resources for the community rather than try to come in and tell the community what to do and when to do it. I think another lesson is just a reminder that organizations that are run by poor people, right, or people that are not in the power structure are always going to be subject to scrutiny. They're always going to have accusations of fiscal mismanagement, of poor, shoddy bookkeeping, right? We still see that today. And so it becomes imperative that you have your ducks in a row. And CDGM did. When Stennis conducted many audits, and less than 1% of $15 million was ever unaccounted for. So it was a reminder that local people, right, these CDGM women in particular, understood that what they were up against, and they tried hard to make sure that their books were always right, that the money was spent correctly, so that they could be above reproach when opposition forces come in and try to use things like that to discredit, to dismantle, and to end their program.
We have come to the top of another hour. It would be wonderful to be able to stay and carry on for another hour with this, but we have reached the end of the time that we have. Thank you all for watching. Remember to join us next week for History is Lunch with Claire Whitlinger. Thank you, Crystal Sanders. The book is A Chance for Change. We will look forward to working more with you in the future.